Keanu Reeves entered the opulent Grand Atoria Hotel on a brisk evening that promised both glamour and hidden tension, his every step a reminder of the quiet strength he carried within. The corridor leading to the main ballroom shimmered with ornate chandeliers, reflecting off polished marble floors as though announcing the presence of the city's most elite gathering. Like a figure composed of equal parts mystery and magnetism, Keanu moved with an unhurried grace, drawing curious eyes despite wearing nothing more ostentatious than a simple dark suit. Behind the gilded doors of the ballroom, an atmosphere of anticipation buzzed like static before a storm. The city's upper crust had arrived adorned in their finest evening gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos, each seeking acknowledgement and admiration. Waitstaff navigated these corridors of wealth with polished shoes and measured smiles, balancing silver trays of champagne that glinted in the dim light. Everywhere, there were murmurs of fortunes made and deals sealed, conspiratorial whispers that implied everyone in that space was accustomed to standing at the pinnacle of success. The Grand Atoria was famous for hosting an annual charity auction benefiting underprivileged children, an event that blended philanthropy with a subtle contest of power. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. At the center of these unspoken rivalries stood Edward Lancaster, an arrogant businessman with an insatiable appetite for public praise. He relished the grand spectacle of any high society gathering, especially when it provided a chance to outdo others in lavish contributions. Beneath the starchy brightness of his white collar and impeccably tailored jacket, he nurtured an ego fed by power and the unwavering attention of those who circled him. On this particular night, Edward's ambitions soared higher than usual. He planned to place a dramatic bid on one of the auction's highlight items, an extraordinarily rare painting rumored to be the star of the show. A handful of lesser items would precede it: a diamond necklace, an exotic travel package, and vintage wine. But he viewed these merely as appetizers before the main course. The painting, with its vibrant strokes and poignant representation of children's boundless hopes, was the trophy that would cement Edward's status in front of the city's elite. As he lingered by a tall, elaborately carved column, Edward observed the arriving guests with critical detachment. He cataloged their significance by the wealth they flaunted, the glimmer of diamonds, the whisper of couture fabrics, the aura of power in every greeting. Some might have bristled at such scrutiny, but for Edward, it was a pastime. He reveled in the knowledge that his presence alone could dominate a room, his boisterous laughter echoing like a prelude to victory. Yet across that same ballroom, Keanu Reeves moved at the fringes with a presence that drew far more attention than Edward's practiced performance. Though soft-spoken and calm, he still seemed to command the environment without uttering a single word of self-congratulation. He offered polite nods to anyone who paused to look, occasionally exchanging courteous smiles with onlookers. None of this carried the typical bravado of a celebrity seeking applause or validation. It was as if he carried a quiet sense of responsibility, an aura that gently suggested he was here for the cause, not the spectacle. The very air of the Grand Atoria seemed to thicken with expectation, as if fate were orchestrating a collision of two men from different worlds, each shaped by a unique moral compass. While Edward thrived on outdoing others in flashy displays, Keanu merely existed in his calm approach to life, placing genuine kindness above fanfare. Their differences would soon stand out starkly, and the story of their meeting would echo long after the final gavel's echo died away. Inside the grand ballroom, an imposing stage took center focus. Thick velvet curtains framed a podium where the auctioneer would soon stand, and a screen behind it displayed the names of sponsors and high-profile donors in looping sequences. Waiters glided past with silver trays, offering champagne to guests engaged in hushed discussions or boisterous self-promotion. A quiet tension rumbled beneath the surface, a sense that tonight might turn out to be more than just an extravagant formality. Edward's gaze drifted over to a grouping of event organizers, scanning for the head of the charity, a poised figure known for her unwavering commitment to underprivileged children. He watched her greet donors with heartfelt gratitude, while in the background, stagehands prepared items for auction, carefully positioning them for the best dramatic impact. Edward deemed all that fuss a necessary show. He was here to make sure his name would stand out as a highlight of the evening. Keanu, meanwhile, was farther from the stage, drinking in the sight of the crowd. He was known for stealth visits to philanthropic events, guided by a sincere belief that if one had the means to help, one should do so without clamoring for a spotlight. Through that charitable lens, he saw the glitz not as a means for social climbing but as an engine for tangible change. The night's auctions would fund scholarships, medical assistance, and educational programs, essentials that could reshape a child's future. Moments later, an elegant hush fell over the crowd, signaling the start of festivities. The host, with a smile of refined grace, stepped onto the stage. She welcomed the attendees and reminded them of why they had gathered. She spoke of children who dreamed of an education, of families who struggled to afford even basic health care. Her words cast a spell that temporarily softened the room's competitive edge, replacing it with a more genuine sense of shared responsibility. Despite that emotional appeal, Edward's mind churned with strategy. He understood the painting would likely trigger an intense bidding war, and he needed to stand triumphant. He imagined the hush that would settle after he placed the final, jaw-dropping bid, the praise swirling around him like perfumed air. The magnitude of that applause would affirm everything he believed himself to be: a winner, someone unstoppable in a room full of other so-called big players. Keanu, however, was unaware that his humble presence had already caught Edward's attention. Edward noticed how staff and guests glanced toward Keanu with a hint of recognition, the kind that grows when someone in the room is quietly remarkable. From a short distance, Edward seethed inwardly, wondering why so many eyes drifted toward a man who seemed to downplay the event's formal dress code, wearing no tie and sporting a calm, almost meditative demeanor. While the diamond necklace and vacation package came under the gavel, Edward exhibited minimal interest, bidding casually to warm up the crowd. The excitement in the room sparked to life every time a new item was unveiled, but nothing matched the gravity each knew the main painting would bring. Edward felt invincible, unbothered by the lesser items, trusting that his financial advantage would crush any competition once the painting arrived. On the opposite side of the room, Keanu's attention flickered between the stage and the informational brochures describing the night's mission. He read about the precarious situations of countless children, the meager resources of their schools, and their struggles with access to medical care. These words anchored his focus on why tonight mattered. He felt a surge of quiet resolve, an unwavering belief that resources should be leveraged for those who needed help most. At last, the painting took center stage beneath a single spotlight. It depicted children in sweeping brushstrokes, forging a shared sense of unity and innocence. Splashes of color suggested hope rising from bleak circumstances, and the piece exuded a rare emotional power that touched the philanthropic spirit of the gathering. The auctioneer's voice resonated. The starting bid would be substantial, reflecting the painting's combined artistic merit and philanthropic importance. To Edward, that piece was a symbol of bragging rights, a chance to dominate the wealthy crowd and proclaim his influence louder than any competitor. He was fully prepared to outbid everyone without hesitation. Yet, before he could place the first dramatic number, Keanu made his move. In a single measured moment, Keanu raised a discreet sign of intent, offering a figure that momentarily silenced the crowded hall. A ripple of surprise passed through onlookers. Few recognized him clearly, but many felt drawn to his unassuming aura. Edward's jaw tightened at the realization that someone dared to challenge him so directly. With a surge of pride, Edward doubled the number, ensuring all eyes shifted from the painting to the bidder. He expected immediate acquiescence. After all, who would keep escalating when faced with such flamboyant confidence? Yet Keanu did not waver. He calmly increased his bid by another significant margin, as if the sums of money meant far less than the ultimate purpose. Murmurs of disbelief spread. The tension, once a quiet undercurrent, now crackled like invisible fireworks above the auction floor. The auctioneer repeated the new bid in a slightly stunned tone, scanning the crowd to see who might dare to follow. Edward's pride spiked, and he placed a bid so high it caused a hush among the spectators. This was the moment he lived for, that pregnant pause of awe, that sense of admiration and sometimes envy from those around him. Yet the hush stretched on, accompanied by sideways glances in Keanu's direction, silent wonder at whether this calm figure would yield or, against all odds, challenge Edward again. Seconds later, Keanu quietly raised the stakes once more. His expression remained measured, his demeanor giving no sign that he sought glory or applause. Onlookers nearly gasped. It became clear that this was more than a casual dispute between wealthy patrons. It was a standoff of core values. One man fought to preserve his personal brand as the unstoppable face of success. The other seemed guided by a calling to support the event's charitable mission at any cost. Edward felt his pulse pounding. For too long, he had floated atop social circles, unchallenged and unashamed. Now, confronted by a man who seemed uninterested in the night's pomp, Edward was forced to confront the possibility that someone else might outshine him. The meltdown in his mind took the form of internal questions. Who was this man, standing unruffled and resolute in front of the city's richest donors? Why didn't he betray any hint of stress? As the numbers soared higher and higher, an almost electric hush blanketed the ballroom. The auctioneer's words came faster, voice cracking under the excitement, as if the swirl of competition was spiraling to a climax. The audience watched the two men as if they were boxers in a ring. One corner exuded arrogance, refusing to yield. The other corner manifested composure, unrelenting in pursuit of providing for those in need. Eventually, Edward tossed out a figure that was dauntingly high, designed to create the final knockout. A faint bead of perspiration glistened on his temple beneath the glittering chandeliers. Everyone braced for the final blow. Yet, in that breathtaking pause, Keanu once again escalated the total. No bravado accompanied it. He simply allowed the new number to echo within the silent hall. The hush, thick as mist, lingered a moment longer. Edward felt as though he stood on the verge of an internal collapse. Going even higher might be possible, but his unraveling ego weighed heavily. Recognizing an invisible threshold, he hesitated. In that hesitation, the gavel struck with authoritative finality, announcing Keanu Reeves as the official owner of the painting. The crestfallen hush broke into surprised applause, some uncertain, others exhilarated by the dramatic outcome. Edward's world tilted. He had lost. More than that, he had been outclassed by someone who seemed uninterested in celebrating the victory. Keanu offered a subtle bow of acknowledgement toward the stage, and bypassing any chance to grandstand, slipped away from the limelight. Confusion tugged at the crowd. Disbelief played across countless expressions. Many guests turned their gaze toward Edward, scrutinizing the furious disappointment he could not entirely conceal. A swirl of staff members descended near Keanu to finalize payments. Through the small cluster, Marie, the lead organizer, offered him a gesture of heartfelt gratitude. Keanu responded with a modest acknowledgement. This was supposed to be Edward's big moment, a chance to flaunt his larger-than-life presence. Instead, he found himself overshadowed by a solitary figure radiating quiet conviction. As soon as the painting's official sale concluded, murmurs began bouncing through the hall like a rumor set free in a crowd hungry for intrigue. People speculated about Keanu's identity, remembered seeing him in films, and recalled occasional stories of his unassuming generosity. Though he had every reason to avoid attention, fate placed him in the center of conversations, upending the customary order of such a high-profile event. Edward drifted toward the back of the ballroom to grapple with his swirling thoughts. He had never imagined that this unassuming man would stand as an obstacle he could not bulldoze. Although irritated, he was also baffled. A small part of him recognized that the man who had outbid him showed no interest in belittling him afterward. The typical arrogance Edward expected from a rival simply wasn't there, leaving him unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, away from the tension that thickened near Edward, Keanu settled the necessary paperwork and offered friendly nods to the staff. His attention lingered once more on the item he had just secured. In the bright lights of the stage, the painting's colors seemed even more radiant, the artistry all the more impactful. Yet, the sum he had spent mattered far less to him than the knowledge that children in desperate circumstances would be able to access better opportunities. His entire focus lay in the potential real-world benefits these funds would bring. Edward watched from a distance as Keanu then moved out of the ballroom into a quieter reception area, heading toward the exit with no trace of pomp. Most who achieved such a triumph would have basked in the post-auction glow, accepting accolades from all sides. Instead, Keanu seemed intent on leaving without the burden of lingering attention, as if he considered the night's main purpose, raising money for those in need, already fulfilled. That subdued departure left Edward both furious and strangely reflective. He realized he had no quick retort or cunning plan to regain the upper hand. Glares from passing guests felt like flickers of humiliation as he stood motionless, anchored by wounded pride. On the stage, the event's host celebrated the successful auction, enumerating how each donation would pave the way for educational grants, health initiatives, and improved outreach programs. The applause that followed stung Edward like an accusation, reminding him that in the end, the cause carried far more significance than his personal quest for recognition. The discrepancy between his aims and Keanu's sincerity illuminated a moral gap he had never before acknowledged. Though the evening had more items to auction and more checks to be collected, the air had shifted. The dramatic duel in bidding had generated a burst of energy that overshadowed everything else. Guests found themselves enthralled by the surprising outcome and whispered guesses about what might have motivated Keanu. Edward skulked out of the main hall into a dim side corridor. He attempted to rationalize his loss, searching for a narrative that made sense. Yet no matter how he spun the story, he remained the man who had been outbid and humbled, not by someone aggressively out for a victory, but by someone whose calm presence dismantled the typical standards of competition. The corridor was barely lit, and the hush gave him an opportunity to confront the vexing sense of discontent. He recalled overhearing the staff mention Keanu Reeves's name once they realized who he was, but Edward had been too preoccupied to grasp the significance. Now, standing alone in a hallway lined with portraits of past philanthropists, Edward realized just how oblivious he had been. A quiet tide of shame lapped at the edges of his conscious thoughts. Had he truly tried to belittle a man whose reputation for kindness and generosity stretched worldwide? The hall's silence enveloped him, pushing him toward uncomfortable self-examination. Was it truly about the painting, or about the children who would benefit? Could he have used his wealth that night to support them without trying to make the moment revolve around himself? Vague resentment kindled in his mind, but it was directed inward as much as toward his new rival. Back in the ballroom, the official program moved forward. Speeches were delivered, the audience applauded additional pledges, and the atmosphere smoothed into a gentle glow of satisfaction. Everyone recognized that the highlight of the night, the clash of bids, would stand out as the central story retold in social circles and news pieces. Keanu's victory held a mesmerizing quality because it defied typical standards of high society competition. Meanwhile, Edward found his way to an ornate balcony on the second floor, overlooking the cityscape. The hush of the open air offered him a pocket of solitude. Faintly, he could hear the echoes of the continuing gala. He could almost envision the painting displayed on a stage somewhere, admired by a swirl of donors who quietly wondered how it had managed to spark such an impassioned battle. The city lights glittered like scattered diamonds across the horizon, a reflection of the ambitions that had driven Edward's entire life. He had built a reputation by dominating business deals and overshadowing others whenever possible. Now, in one evening, that persona had been upended by a man who asked for no attention, who simply allowed his actions to speak. That paradox rattled Edward more than he cared to admit. Suddenly, it struck Edward that perhaps tonight wasn't a straightforward defeat but an invitation to change. If someone like Keanu Reeves, beloved for his unselfish spirit, chose to invest so much money into that painting without seeking applause, maybe there was another way to engage in philanthropy. Perhaps there was a way to let sincerity guide charitable acts, rather than orchestrating them for show. Yet old habits died hard. Even as Edward wrestled with these thoughts, bitterness lingered. He had been publicly outbid, overshadowed in an environment where he was used to shining brightest. The pain of that blow to his ego coexisted with a faint sense of intrigue about a man who managed to exist outside the unspoken rules of high-class competitions. Below him, guests trickled out in pairs and small groups, stepping into waiting limousines or elegant town cars. Their laughter and conversation floated up to the balcony, reminding Edward of the social world he had so confidently navigated. Tonight, that world felt less like a stage for his triumphs and more like a mirror reflecting the hollowness of his pursuit. He turned away from the railing, deciding to leave the charity event before the final items came under the hammer. He knew his departure would spark more speculation. Some might brand him a sore loser. Others might guess he was dealing with urgent business. In truth, Edward was leaving because, for the first time in his adult life, he had no desire to remain in the spotlight. His driver waited near the grand entrance, the car's headlights cutting through the faint fog that had settled over the streets. As Edward sank into the leather seat, his thoughts circled like restless moths around a flame. He wondered where Keanu was at that moment. Perhaps already gone, drifting into the night with that same calm detachment. Or maybe still behind the scenes, quietly ensuring the funds were properly allocated. For Edward, such possibilities felt revolutionary, far removed from the petty power moves to which he had grown accustomed. On another side of town, Keanu drove himself away from the hotel, his reflection in the rearview mirror illuminating a sense of measured relief. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. The painting, now legally his, served as a catalyst for resources that would fund scholarships and medical supplies, giving children a helping hand in difficult times. Keanu maintained his usual preference for privacy, content in knowing he had done what he could. In the days that followed, stories of the dramatic bidding war rippled through social circles and media outlets. Gossip columnists spun it as a rare confrontation between a reclusive Hollywood figure and a notorious tycoon, while art critics dissected the painting's emotional resonance. Meanwhile, philanthropic circles praised the sum raised, highlighting that the children's fund had surpassed its expected goal. Edward, to his surprise, kept returning to the memory of Keanu's calm, unwavering posture. That single visual replayed in his mind, challenging him to reconcile it with his usual worldview. He wrestled with the sensation that he had encountered a deep truth about genuine generosity. It did not require fanfare. In that sense, it demanded far more courage than Edward had ever demonstrated. At night, while he tried to push away persistent doubts, Edward delved into scattered news stories about Keanu. Each discovery confirmed the actor's habit of giving quietly, whether slipping financial gifts to struggling individuals or consistently supporting charitable causes out of the spotlight. These stories bothered Edward less for their content and more for the nagging question they inspired. Had Edward been living his entire life in the shallow end of real achievement? As the days stretched onward, the ripples caused by that single auction grew. They moved beyond the Grand Atoria's glittering walls, affecting not only the children destined to benefit from the money raised, but also the hearts and minds of those who had observed or participated in the spectacle. For Edward, the event forced him into an uncharacteristic introspection. For Keanu, It was another quiet step in a lifelong pattern of using his influence to inspire good. No single moment sealed Edward's transformation, nor did a flash of epiphany rewrite his personality overnight. Instead, seeds of reflection took root, nourished by the memory of Keanu's serene gaze and unwavering philanthropic determination. The city's socialites continued to buzz about the upset at the auction, speculating over the long-term ramifications for Edward's public image. Some expected him to double down on his arrogance. Others quietly hoped a new humility might emerge. Even so, an undercurrent of expectation flowed around them. The next time Edward and Keanu crossed paths, many wondered what would happen. Would Edward revert to his old bravado, or would he approach the actor with newfound respect? How would the children's charity evolve with such significant donations channeled into its coffers? Each question lingered like a puzzle piece, waiting for the correct moment to click into place. Through it all, Keanu remained largely absent from the fanfare. In the absence of any loud victory lap, the city was left to speculate on its own. People began to realize that humility, when combined with genuine compassion, stands as a powerful force that can shift an entire atmosphere. The memory of that night settled into the city's collective consciousness, a testament to the quiet potency of sincere giving. High above the shining skyline, as the final aftertaste of the charity auction lingered, Edward Lancaster found himself once again in his penthouse suite. He faced floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the city lights like 1,000 tiny beacons. For the first time, those dazzling reminders of success felt bittersweet. The hush of his living space forced him to confront questions about his choices. Yet the future remained unwritten. Within that uncertainty lived the possibility of change, a chance to redefine ambition, to transform the hunger for applause into a generosity that asked for nothing in return. Keanu Reeves had shown him that path, not through bold declarations, but through a calm resolve and a clear vision of who truly mattered, the children whose lives could be uplifted by each dollar spent. In this moment of inwardness, Edward considered what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. He could continue as the wealthy, brash businessman who bulldozed rivals into submission, or he could become someone else entirely. Without a single spoken exchange, Keanu had issued an unspoken challenge to rise to a higher standard of giving, one that transcended ego. Edward lingered in this introspective haze, uncertain whether he had the courage to follow such an example, but unmistakably intrigued by its power. Thus, the stage was set for a deeper transformation. The seeds had been planted under the gleaming chandeliers and watchful eyes of the city's elite. Though no confrontation remained on the surface, the real battle began in Edward's heart, a silent confrontation with the boundaries of his own ego. Keanu Reeves stepped into a modest downtown cafe on a cloudy afternoon that promised possibility despite the somber sky. The flicker of a warm interior light contrasted sharply with the gray streetscape outside. Inside, the muted bustle of patrons and the gentle hum of jazz music created a pocket of comfortable calm, allowing him to settle into a corner table without attracting unwanted attention. He had come here in the hopes of meeting a quiet collaborator from the Atoria Children's Fund, a meeting set in the aftermath of the very auction where he had outbid Edward Lancaster. For Keanu, that night at the Grand Atoria Hotel felt like a crossroads, a single moment that sparked conversations and reflections far beyond the immediate excitement of an intense bidding war. Above all else, it reminded him of the importance of direct engagement with the causes he supported. Though his lifestyle was often described by the outside world as that of a Hollywood star, his daily reality involved minimal fanfare. He preferred an unassuming schedule whenever possible. The only indulgence he allowed himself consistently was the small pleasure of decent coffee in an unpretentious environment, where the staff might only fleetingly recognize him. On this day, he ordered a black coffee and sat with his thoughts, reflecting on how his intention at the auction had been straightforward: to bolster the resources for children in need. He remembered the face of Edward Lancaster looming at the other end of the ballroom, brandishing bids with a bravado that seemed on the verge of bursting through every seam of his expensive tuxedo. Keanu had not intended for the interaction to escalate into a high-stakes showdown, and yet he also understood that sometimes the simplest form of giving, a direct, substantial contribution, could inadvertently become a statement. The city's social circles quickly latched on to that statement, scrutinizing the two men as if it were a morality tale in real time. Amid these reflections, Keanu considered how few people realized that such public gestures were not his preference. He would have rather placed his bid quietly and avoided the swirling commentary of who outbid whom. Nevertheless, the highlight of that night was how so many children would gain scholarships, health care, or essential resources. For Keanu, that was the overarching point. He finished the last sip of his coffee and spotted the Atoria Children's Fund representative near the doorway. Their conversation, though purely logistical, held profound significance for him, because the next steps meant taking real, tangible strides for kids in underserved neighborhoods. True to his style, he asked no praise for his recent donation, urging that the funds be funneled into educational programs first. Without fanfare or ceremony, he passed along additional details for future grants before shaking the representative's hand and slipping out onto the street once more. Outside, the city's tall buildings rose like quiet witnesses to countless everyday dramas. People rushed in all directions, drawn by errands, jobs, or family commitments. It was in these busy streets that Keanu found a comforting anonymity. He moved among office workers and local shop owners, blending into the tapestry of normalcy that always made him feel most grounded. Meanwhile, high above this commotion, in the glossy penthouse suite of an upscale tower, Edward Lancaster lingered by a vast window, staring at the horizon. His thoughts had been unsettled since the charity auction. Weeks had passed, yet the memory of Keanu's calm, decisive outbidding haunted him in unexpected ways. It was less the defeat itself. Edward could endure losing a competition, than the realization that the man who outbid him had done so without a shred of arrogance. Edward had begun to see this humility as a profound strength, the sort of unspoken force that quietly rewrote one's perspective. In the aftermath, Edward had tried to launch a new philanthropic effort of his own. No longer content to merely sign checks, he wanted to shape a foundation that would provide the same kind of direct impact Keanu's presence suggested. He often recalled the children's faces in the brochures and the desperate living conditions those brochures summarized. The enormity of it overwhelmed him, but something in him felt compelled to try. For years, Edward's world had revolved around social status, exclusive invitations, elegant dinners, and a network of business connections designed to multiply his wealth. Only now was he realizing that such pursuits, while dazzling, lacked the depth and warmth he had glimpsed that night at the charity event. Though the first part of Edward's transformation had begun with embarrassment and self-reflection, the next part involved facing his own limitations as he learned how challenging genuine philanthropic engagement could be. He discovered that running a foundation required more than money. It demanded empathy, cooperation, planning, and a willingness to humbly learn from others. The board meetings for his fledgling foundation showcased an Edward that few of his colleagues recognized: quieter, more thoughtful, and occasionally unsure of himself. This uncertainty was new territory, like an uncharted map he now had to navigate. At times, Edward found his old ego rearing its head. During early planning sessions, he caught himself wanting to dominate discussions or dismiss the suggestions of social workers who cautioned him about the realities of slum living and educational disparities. Yet, he gradually reined in those impulses. Each meeting reminded him that helping others effectively was less about commanding a boardroom and more about listening to those who understood the needs on the ground. One rainy evening, Edward ventured out of his penthouse to visit an after-school program the Atoria Children's Fund had helped establish. He took no entourage or press, merely a single driver to navigate the slick roads. The area he arrived in was a stark contrast to the polished heart of the city. Streets were pockmarked with potholes. Small corner shops displayed flickering neon signs, and worn-down apartment buildings towered on either side like weathered sentinels. The after-school center, modest but alive with activity, featured brightly painted walls covered in children's drawings. Educational posters curled slightly at the edges, taped onto boards that had seen better days. Teenagers huddled over homework assignments, while volunteers offered tutoring and supportive encouragement. This environment reminded Edward of how different life could be for those without the privileges he had always taken for granted. In a moment of solemn reflection, Edward thought about what might happen if these programs didn't exist. Children would drift home to cramped apartments or loiter on streets brimming with possible pitfalls. By simply supporting well-structured initiatives, he could empower a generation to break free of cycles that had trapped families for decades. Watching it unfold in real time moved him more than any luxurious gala ever had. At the same time, across town, Keanu Reeves found himself contacted by the local children's hospital he had also supported in the wake of the charity auction's success. They informed him that the infusion of funds had allowed them to purchase specialized equipment for diagnosing pediatric illnesses more accurately. One of the hospital's administrators, with a voice brimming with gratitude, expressed hope that he might visit for a small ribbon cutting. In the spirit of humility, Keanu gently declined a ceremonial event. Instead, he asked if he could drop by to meet the staff and families without any media presence. The hospital complied, and early one morning, Keanu arrived in casual attire. The staff welcomed him warmly but sensed his desire for low-key interactions. He passed through the bright corridors, sometimes hearing the beeping of medical monitors, other times catching sight of parents who looked exhausted yet hopeful. Meeting nurses and doctors, he listened as they explained how specialized equipment, purchased through donations, significantly reduced delays in treatment. Children diagnosed earlier had a better chance of a full recovery. During that visit, Keanu spent time in a quiet recreation room, admiring finger paintings on the walls. Despite the heavy realities of the hospital environment, this small space held an aura of optimism, filled with the joyous colors and imaginative scrawls created by young patients. He marveled at how children's resilience could shine even in grim conditions. For him, these moments confirmed that any act of giving, no matter how large or small, was worth it if it brought relief to families in crisis. Later that same afternoon, Edward Lancaster received an unexpected phone call from a liaison at the Atoria Children's Fund. They mentioned that Keanu Reeves had visited the hospital to see how the donations were being put to use. Hearing Keanu's name again, Edward felt a mix of curiosity and anxiety. He sensed that their stories were running parallel, drawn toward the same philanthropic circles, though Edward was still learning how to act with grace and sincerity in those realms. Encouraged by the liaison's words, Edward accepted an invitation to tour the children's hospital himself. He did not anticipate running into Keanu there, as the liaison explained that Keanu's visit had already concluded. Nonetheless, the possibility lingered in the back of Edward's mind, stirring remnants of discomfort. How would he respond if confronted with that steady, composed gaze again, especially now that he understood more about genuine giving? When Edward arrived at the hospital, he was given a guided tour by the same administrator who had hosted Keanu. Without witnessing the quiet presence of the actor himself, Edward could still sense the ripple effects. One of the nurses explained that the expanded budget had recently saved a child's life by fast-tracking an urgent medical test. Hearing this practical outcome, Edward felt a profound surge of humility. He realized that his pride had overshadowed the deeper meaning of charitable work for too long. As the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers that afternoon, Keanu settled in his own apartment, a modest dwelling with comfortable furnishings and an emphasis on personal touches rather than lavish decor. He reflected on the hospital visit, replaying the gratitude he had witnessed. As always, These reflections strengthened his resolve to stay involved in meaningful projects, to share his resources whenever they could ease someone's burden. In that same twilight hour, Edward returned to his penthouse, packing the length of floor-to-ceiling windows. The nurse's words about lives being saved echoed in his thoughts. He compared that to the forced applause he had once chased at every gala. The difference cut deep. Applause was fleeting, but saving a life changed everything forever. In that realization, he felt a subtle shift, as though something vital was reorienting within him. The following week, the Atoria Children's Fund announced a special outreach initiative, a series of workshops to train volunteers in mentoring, fundraising, and community-building projects. They invited donors, staff, and local philanthropists alike, hoping to bridge the gap between wealthy sponsors and volunteer coordinators on the ground. Keanu Reeves, known for his unpublicized but consistent participation in philanthropic causes, planned to attend quietly. This was an opportunity for him to learn more about the communities that would benefit directly from the funds raised at the Grand Atoria auction. When he received the invitation, he noted with interest that Edward Lancaster was expected to be among the attendees. He had no ill will toward Edward, nor did he expect any kind of confrontation. If anything, Keanu was intrigued by rumors that Edward had softened and was taking his philanthropic role more seriously. On the morning of the workshop, the venue buzzed with cautious excitement. A set of large rooms, typically used for community gatherings, had been arranged with folding tables, informational pamphlets, and presentation boards. Volunteers engaged in warm chatter, while social workers set up stations to explain the pressing needs in local neighborhoods. Executives in tailored suits mingled with grassroots community leaders, an unorthodox mix that sometimes led to awkward introductions. Keanu arrived in a simple outfit, dark pants, a comfortable sweater, and worn shoes that gave no hint of wealth or stardom. A few participants recognized him, but they respected his unspoken wish to blend into the collective effort. He wandered from table to table, reading about various programs that ranged from nutrition and medical outreach to counseling and academic mentorship. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of how one donation could have a domino effect, inspiring additional contributions or volunteering initiatives. Farther along, Edward Lancaster stood beside a trifold poster depicting renovation plans for rundown community centers. His posture indicated a kind of openness he rarely displayed in business settings. His assistant pointed out the significance of the photos on display: half-broken floors, peeling paint, and unsecure entrances that made these places less inviting for children and teens. Renovating them would require more than just money. It would need a team of planners, builders, and enthusiastic volunteers. For a moment, Edward locked eyes with Keanu across the room. The atmosphere felt charged, not with rivalry, but with the weight of the journey each had taken since that night. Keanu offered the barest of nods, a silent acknowledgement that they were, in this moment, aligned in a shared purpose. Edward, feeling a flicker of uncertainty, reciprocated the nod before returning his focus to the display. The workshop began with a series of brief introductions, each speaker highlighting their specific role in the wide web of philanthropic activity. While typical conferences might have featured lengthy speeches, this gathering embraced a more hands-on approach. Attendees split into smaller groups, each tasked with envisioning concrete solutions for local challenges. One group tackled education gaps, another studied healthcare provisions, while yet another mapped out safe recreation zones for children in rough neighborhoods. Edward found himself stepping into the healthcare group, where doctors and social workers guided them through the complexities of providing consistent care. He listened intently, scarcely able to believe how naive he had once been about the intricacies of distributing resources. These professionals explained how ensuring a proper supply chain for medical equipment involved negotiating with manufacturers, training hospital staff on specialized machinery, and allocating funds for ongoing maintenance, not just initial purchases. In a neighboring group, Keanu absorbed details on after-school support and mentorship programs. He marveled at the passion of local activists who worked long hours without seeking praise, tackling community problems with sheer tenacity. One volunteer spoke about kids who struggled with homework due to language barriers at home, requiring specialized tutors. Another described the sense of safety a well-maintained after-school center could provide, pulling teens away from street violence. The workshop ended with an open forum, where participants from different groups reconvened to share insights. A hum of collaboration filled the room, a chorus of urgent problems met by creative, determined solutions. Keanu quietly contributed thoughts on how to encourage sustainable funding, suggesting partnerships with local businesses that might be swayed more by personal relationships than by large, impersonal sponsorship deals. Edward, on the other hand, found himself unexpectedly emboldened to recount his recent tour of various facilities, painting a picture of how deeply neglected some city corners truly were. He spoke in an even voice, lacking the showmanship that once peppered his every word. Instead of boasting, he simply described the numbers he had seen and the potential life-changing impact that modest renovations could have. The reaction from the group was measured but positive, revealing that sincerity carried far more weight than hollow declarations. At the close of the day, as volunteers began to pack up brochures and planners, Edward noticed Keanu standing alone near a display about orphan outreach programs. Without any trace of his old swagger, Edward walked over. The moment felt significant, like two converging lines in a blueprint of philanthropy. Though they never exchanged direct dialogue, the scene felt like a silent conversation, a handshake of empathy, an understanding that both men had evolved since the night one outbid the other. Keanu took in the images of orphan children engaged in art classes, reading circles, and small group therapy sessions. Such programs received precious little media coverage, overshadowed by more headline-friendly events. Yet these quiet efforts, so crucial for children navigating the aftermath of loss and abandonment, stirred his desire to continue contributing well beyond the auction. Edward studied Keanu's calm stance, reading in his expression a reflective unity with the cause. He remembered how puzzling it had felt to be bested by someone who never gloated. Now, he saw it as an invitation to do better, not as a humiliation. Where once he might have allowed resentment to fester, he now felt an earnest gratitude for that unexpected push. He had been forced to reevaluate himself, and he liked the new path he was forging. The final waves of participants filed out, leaving only a handful of people finishing up. Keanu lingered, glancing back at each display as though storing mental snapshots of all the unmet needs. He knew that a single workshop was just the beginning, a spark that could either fizzle or ignite a sustainable movement. In that quiet space, he thought of how each person's donation of time or funds multiplied when minds and hearts combined. Before leaving, Keanu approached an organizer to confirm his pledge of ongoing support for a tutoring initiative, wanting to ensure the funds were allocated for the long term rather than a one-time burst. The organizer expressed gratitude, praising both Keanu's and Edward's involvement in the day's events. Word had traveled that Edward Lancaster, once aloof and self-absorbed, was now at the front lines of philanthropic collaboration, demonstrating personal interest in the practicalities of making life better for others. That evening, Keanu returned to his apartment with a thoughtful serenity that accompanied him through dinner. He mulled over the presence of Edward, recalling the man's earlier arrogance at the hotel. The shift he had witnessed today felt genuine. It hinted at the notion that no transformation was beyond reach when someone chose to embrace humility and compassion. With that comforting possibility in mind, Keanu felt the soft hum of hope for the city's future reverberating through him. Across town, Edward found himself hunched over a laptop in his penthouse, combing through digital proposals from community groups. These were real requests for real projects: clean water filters in older school buildings, technology upgrades for outdated library computers, meal programs for families facing temporary hardships. he realized how endless the needs were. Yet within that vastness, he felt a quiet conviction that every effort, no matter how small, could be part of a wider mosaic of change. Late into the night, Edward composed messages to potential partners, layering in the practical knowledge he had picked up at the workshop. He no longer viewed philanthropic work as an arms race of who could spend more money or garner more applause. It was about carefully leveraging resources, forging alliances, and working alongside people who devoted their entire lives to public service. Through the weeks that followed, Edward began volunteering at some of the very programs he funded. He discovered the tangible rewards of direct involvement, bonding with children who recognized his face from a local classroom refurbishment, chatting with families who needed a new roof over their makeshift community center, and supporting teachers who had far too many students crammed into small learning spaces. In these encounters, Edward felt the frayed edges of his old identity unraveling. The man who once relished grand public victories had found a more lasting kind of satisfaction in the quiet ripple of constructive change. There were no photographers snapping pictures for a newspaper's front page, and no glamorous socialites remarking on his generosity. Yet he realized he no longer craved those illusions of success. Meanwhile, Keanu maintained his rhythm of understated giving. He met regularly with the staff of the Atoria Children's Fund, discussing ways to expand scholarship programs for youth who yearned for college but lacked financial support. He kept track of new developments at the Children's Hospital, providing timely injections of funds when equipment or special projects demanded them. Over time, he also established a mentorship program that connected volunteer professionals to teenagers aiming for careers in technical fields. With each passing month, word spread through philanthropic circles that something remarkable was happening. The city had become a nexus for collaborative giving, driven in part by the unexpected synergy between Edward Lancaster and Keanu Reeves. The transformation enthralled local reporters and even national media outlets. Journalists sought interviews, hoping to capture what they perceived as a rare partnership that bridged corporate might and celebrity influence. True to form, Keanu declined nearly all such requests, explaining through polite intermediaries that he preferred to see the focus remain on the children. Edward, once addicted to public recognition, found himself echoing the same sentiment, telling media reps that the story they should cover was how each dollar impacted young lives. Over time, curiosity about their personal motives faded, replaced by coverage of the results. New classrooms, modernized clinics, and the blossoming of countless opportunities for underserved communities. Still, the day came when a larger charity gala, an annual centerpiece in the city's social calendar, extended a joint invitation to both men. The event commemorated major philanthropic strides, shining a spotlight on those who had contributed significantly to local causes. Edward felt a pang of irony. Only a year ago, he would have leapt at the chance to grace such a stage. Now he hesitated, unsure if participating aligned with his new convictions. Keanu also received the invitation, accompanied by heartfelt personal requests from the event organizers. They argued that by appearing, he could inspire others to believe in the power of collective generosity. After mulling it over, Keanu agreed to attend, planning only to present a short reflective piece about the importance of unity in charitable efforts. On the night of the gala, the venue dazzled with sweeping arches and elaborate floral arrangements. Prominent figures arrived wearing formal attire, and the glimmer of chandeliers reminded both Edward and Keanu of the very stage where their paths had first meaningfully intersected. A hush descended when organizers introduced them alongside a diverse group of teachers, doctors, social workers, and volunteers, each responsible for achievements that improved children's lives. The crowd watched as Edward Lancaster stood with a humility that made him nearly unrecognizable from his formerly bombastic self. Beside him, Keanu Reeves embodied the same quiet grace that had once shaken Edward's self-perception to its core. One by one, Each person in the group shared the ways in which collaboration had elevated their cause. Teachers spoke of new classrooms and specialized learning programs. Volunteers from the hospital recounted advanced treatments now available to low-income families. Social workers detailed safer community spaces that had cut down on youth crime. Their voices blended into a tapestry of collective triumph, painting a vivid picture of hope for the future. When it came Keanu's turn to address the audience, he adhered to the narrative style of recounting progress, rather than delivering a grandiose speech. He guided listeners through the sequence of small steps taken by many hands, showcasing how each contribution dovetailed into another, forging an unbreakable chain of support for children in need. He explained that genuine impact often started with simple gestures, snowballing into large-scale change when met with honesty and cooperation. The audience, deeply moved, offered grateful applause that felt genuine, far from the performative claps Edward had once chased. Edward also had a moment under the spotlight. He presented a summary of the Lancaster Foundation's new projects, emphasizing data collected from social workers and community leaders. Instead of bragging about the amounts donated, he focused on how every success depended on partnerships. He admitted that he had previously misunderstood the essence of giving, prioritizing prestige over purpose. This candid confession resonated in the hall, eliciting supportive claps from those who appreciated his candor. As the evening drew to a close, a final wave of applause erupted, not for a single figure, but for the collective achievements of everyone dedicated to improving children's lives. Keanu and Edward, standing side by side with volunteers and medical professionals, let themselves be part of a unified applause that honored the entire community's efforts. Through it all, the sense of shared victory eclipsed any single individual's role, which was precisely how Keanu believed philanthropy should function. When the event concluded, many attendees streamed out to waiting cars, voices filled with optimism about continuing efforts. Keanu slipped quietly through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras poised at the front. Edward, noticing the subtle exit, followed suit without hesitation. In a dimly lit corridor lined with the event's spare equipment, he caught sight of Keanu retrieving his coat from a small storage area. A nod passed between them. Though neither man voiced anything aloud, it was clear that both felt the weight of gratitude for how much the world had changed since their fateful bidding war. Keanu's unwavering calm had become a catalyst for Edward's transformation. In return, Edward's newly awakened dedication, fueled by resources and a reformed outlook, had broadened the reach of the city's philanthropic network. In that unspoken moment, Edward reflected on the irony that such a deep bond had sprung from what could have remained a petty rivalry. He was reminded yet again that compassion frequently hides behind unexpected doors, sometimes unlocked by humility, sometimes flung open by adversity. For his part, Keanu realized how powerful it was to see a single act of giving radiate outward, touching the hearts and minds of those once trapped in cycles of ambition and self-importance. They parted ways into the night, each heading in a different direction, but united by an enduring commitment to making sure the funds from the Grand Atoria auction, and the spirit it ignited, continued to ripple outwards. A sense of calm reverence settled over them both, fueled by the knowledge that the real winners of their unusual collision were the children whose futures now shone a little brighter. In the weeks and months that followed, countless stories emerged. Teenagers earning scholarships that allowed them to attend top universities, families receiving crucial medical care in times of crisis, and entire communities breathing easier under newly refurbished centers. Through all of that, Keanu maintained his characteristic low profile, never seeking to cast himself as a savior. Edward, too, discovered an enduring joy in lifting people up behind the scenes, turning away from the bravado that once defined him. Thus, the legacy of their first meeting became a parable of quiet strength and lasting change. Where the city's elite once gathered to celebrate and jostle for status, there now stood an evolving philanthropic movement that transcended individual egos. Men like Edward Lancaster, no longer hoarded influence, and figures like Keanu Reeves continued to inspire through steady consistency. In time, the night at the Grand Atoria Hotel passed into local folklore, an emblem of how a single charitable cause could unite two very different men in a shared destiny to serve others. The final result was that each child reached by these combined efforts had a better chance at discovering their own gifts, forging their own futures, and transcending circumstances that once seemed insurmountable. And so concluded the unexpected journey sparked by two contradictory personalities bidding on a painting in a grand ballroom. There was no celebratory fanfare or triumphant spotlight for either man. Instead, they each carried on with a keen sense of responsibility, watching as an entire network of charitable giving blossomed through schools, clinics, and community centers. If measured by the scale of its moral impact, their collaboration, inadvertent though it was, became a beacon of hope in a world too often blinded by vanity. In the end, the only applause that mattered was the quiet joy in the eyes of children now set on brighter paths, unencumbered by the struggles of poverty or neglect. For Keanu Reeves, that was the resolution he valued most. Through every subtle gesture of generosity, he reassured the world that modest actions rooted in kindness could shift even the most rigid mindsets. In that same spirit, Edward Lancaster carried the lesson forward, determined that his name might one day be less associated with arrogance than with a genuine desire to uplift others. Far from the noise of camera flashes or public accolades, the two men continued living their lives, bound by a shared knowledge that authentic generosity seeks no audience. In that quiet truth, the city's children found their greatest advocates, and the world, for a moment, tilted more gently on its axis. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.